Dream machine. .com, HL7, I18 and snap. We're building the future, never looking back.
How much of the artificial intelligence hype in radiology has actually shown up in the reading room? Because if you rewind the clock a bit, the predictions were bold. Around the same time, Elon Musk was promising that we're going to have fully self-driving cars in just a couple of years. Geoff Hinton famously was saying, we might want to stop training radiologists altogether. The machines, it seemed, were about to take over. And yet here we are, years later, radiologists are getting into their cars, stuck in traffic, driving to work. They get to the hospital, they get to their workstation, and they read images the old-fashioned way, traffic jams and night shifts included. So welcome to Imaging Informatics Unplugged. Today's episode takes a closer look at where imaging AI actually stands right now. Not the conference keynote version, but the real version where hospitals have to decide whether these tools actually work, whether they integrate into clinical workflow, and whether anyone is actually seeing a return on investment. To help unpack that, I'm joined by Dr. Ben Fine. Ben is a radiologist and clinician scientist at Trillium Health Partners, where he leads the AI Deployment and Evaluation Lab, or AIDE. His team focuses on something that is surprisingly rare in healthcare AI, rigorously evaluating whether these tools work in real clinical environments. He also serves as the department lead for quality and informatics and the AI lead for the Department of Medical Imaging at the University of Toronto. Before medicine, Ben completed a master's degree in chemical engineering at MIT and later earned his MD from the University of Toronto. That background puts him in a very interesting position at the intersection of engineering, clinical medicine, and health system strategy. In this conversation, we talk about the early hype cycle around imaging AI, why adoption has been slower than many people were expecting, and why some of the most valuable AI use cases may turn out to be the quiet operational improvements, the plumbing that make clinical workflows run better. We also discuss the work that Ben and his team have done building a real-world evaluation lab for imaging AI, why understanding how these systems fail is just as important as understanding how they succeed, and why governance, despite it being the least exciting word in healthcare, may end up being one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. So with all that said, let's get into it. Here is my conversation with Dr. Ben Fine. One last thing, if you enjoy these conversations, like and subscribe. It helps get the word out there. And keep an eye on nagelsconsulting.com. We have very exciting updates related to some courses, some new courses that are going to be available coming in the next couple weeks. Let's jump into it. Okay, so welcome, Ben. I appreciate you joining me for an episode of Imaging Informatics Unplugged.
Hey, Jason. Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad we could finally make this happen.
After quite some time, yeah. It's we tried to get you on season 1. You're joining for season 2, like sitcom. Does better in the second season here, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I had to make sure it was good enough. And the viewership was high enough for just to make sure. Not that I had any doubt ever in you, Jason.
There we go. So our conversation is going to center a bit around imaging and a bit around AI. I think where we first intersected was around interest in artificial intelligence, and maybe we'll talk about how we intersected on a certain paper with some students from the Vector Institute. But before we get to that, I wanted to kind of start out, we're Toronto based, and Toronto has a very interesting history with modern AI and this big boom that we're experiencing. If we go back to 2012, there's AlexNet, and then a couple years later, there's a big bold proclamation from Geoff Hinton that we should stop training radiologists. They're the coyote going off the cliff. So I wanted to get your sense of, now in hindsight, we saw those proclamations, we've seen what's happening. Where do you stand right now as far as when we look back? Where did the hype misunderstand clinical reality?
It's a great question. And, I love that you're emphasizing the Toronto area, because I think the other piece that is an opportunity in Toronto and still untapped is, the whole imaging universe the contribution of kind of the Toronto-Waterloo corridor to early PAC systems. You probably know them better than I do. Whatever, the Mitras and the whoever's of the world. How many PACs?
Ramsoft,
Ramsoft, even what's it called, Intellerad, to some degree, all came out of this clear canvas back in the day. They all came out of the same corridor and a bunch of other PACS tools. So there is this like imaging informatics talent density that also exists in the same area as the AI talent density that you're kind of describing. And that's probably an area that still needs to be unleashed. We could talk about if you want to. But anyways, it's interesting that you asked the question, where are we in AI and what did we get wrong 5 or 7 years ago? I think it was almost that long ago when Geoff Hinton stood up at, I think, Rotman School of Management in his famous quote and basically said radiologists are like Wile E. Coyote. They've run off the cliff, but they don't know it yet. And certainly for the last 5 or 7 years, I've been, jokingly cursing that man, because when I'm up at 2 a.m. and reading x-rays, it doesn't feel like the robots are helping me at all. It still feels like the middle of the night. And there's not many people who enjoy doing that sort of work at that sort of hour. So maybe the robots would be helpful. But they haven't really manifested that way. And I think, I think we're experiencing something like Amara's law, if you're familiar with it, with the idea that we tend to, for any new technological innovation, we tend to overestimate the impact in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. And I actually think radiology is close to turning the corner there. In terms of the last 5 to 7 years, you can see billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions, maybe that's a bit much, tens for sure, into radiology AI development, both from governments and kind of private capital. And what do we have to show for it? Realistically, today, 1% of workflow is augmented or automated with an AI tool of some kind. If you looked at the thousands of studies an average practice does a week, how many of them have some kind of AI tool? One, and then how many are generating some real ROI from those tools? We're in the percents at max. So there's not a ton to show for it. And I think a lot of the adoption has kind of been FOMO driven, where it's like, Jimmy's hospital down the street is doing it, so we should do it because it sounds like a cool thing to do and we can tell our patients that we're doing AI. I think that drives a lot of it, certainly in Canada. In the US, they're much more ROI driven, and there's some interesting incentives which drive a lot of the adoption there, and that is detection of things that may not have been detected before that you can kind of bill for. The last 5 or 7 years has been some adoption, but it's like a percent or so. I think what's happening now, and that was kind of the deep learning era. That was the AlexNet, as you kind of referred to, and the era when, again, venture capitalists said, what's something really expensive we think we can automate with convolutional neural networks? And they're like, oh, the radiologist. So let's just do that. I think the long-term bet could be right about can we automate certain tasks of a radiologist, but also the manifestation of it may not be the right bet. So when we talk about the evolution in models, we've now entered the language vision model era or the foundation model era, where we can now train these models at scale. It's very expensive, but they can do a lot more than just classify diseases. And especially as we get to the universe of being able to generate suggestions or reports or parts of reports, we now move from just kind of detection assistance or augmentation from the radiologist lens, also assisting in the actual workload. And that's very interesting. That hasn't happened yet, but you can see early signs that it is going to happen. Well, I think we've been disappointed so far. I actually think the next 3 years are going to be very interesting in radiology to see how much adoption actually happens and what the implications of that are.
You mentioned expenses. There's investment that goes into this. These are not cheap tools that we're setting up here. And, maybe this is a question that is beyond just imaging AI, but it's also focused on hello to the child that walked in the background.
It's not real.
But it's also focused.
He's generated.
It's an AI avatar. I'm curious, beyond just imaging AI, the impact of the investment and getting a return on that investment. There's a lot of cost to the chips, cost to the data center. Do you see this? Because when we were building out the infrastructure for the web and we were putting fiber on the floors of the ocean, that fiber is still there. the chips that we're buying today are not going to be useful in about 10 years or whatever the lifespan of that chip is. I'm curious how you foresee longevity in this space when it comes to investment, when it comes to thinking about like making this a sustainable business model as a whole.
That's a big question. I think depends where in the so many cute AI generated bots in my background. That's what happens when your office is on the way to the kitchen, or basically in the kitchen for now. I think it depends at where in the stack we're talking about and which vertical. So, if we're talking about the whole AI universe, that's who's actually, and the data centers and the kind of hardware infrastructure, the people investing in those are the cloud companies, and they have a ROI across verticals, like every call to GPT, is in an OpenAI or Microsoft data center. And that's generating ROI for even your usual $20 a month kind of subscription. So I think that's a bit of a different math than two important players in healthcare, which is or maybe three, the end user, so the health system or the radiologist, the software vendor per se, so like the ADOCs or the Cures or the whoever, and the venture capitalists, the people investing in those particular companies. And I think if I could guess, the venture capitalists who are putting money into those companies have yet to see the returns because the health providers who they're selling to have yet to see the returns. But I think, like I mentioned before, that could turn the corner. But I think we in Canada, if we want to go there, have a unique problem in that we're not very good customers in general. We don't pay a lot of money and we're not fast to adopt things in general, which I think in this space is kind of adoption of these tools is necessarily delayed. It's always been the case. I mean, you look at EHRs being deployed across Canada, it's at least a decade behind the US. And if that's your comparator, and certainly behind many jurisdictions in Europe. So we seem to have adopted some combination of the worst practices from various jurisdictions. But in general, I think the fact that we don't spend much on AI means that we're not going to see, and I'll just say Canadian health system, let's say, means that we're not going to see a bunch of returns that quickly. Now, having said that, it means in theory, if we use that time to learn and be smarter about where we deploy our capital, that could work in our favor. And there are elements and signals that some entities are doing it correctly, although I don't think it's being broadcast. Like, for example, I'm pretty sure, although I don't know how it's funded, and I think it should have been smarter funded, but in theory, because of work like you've done with OCINet and whatnot, and connecting all the imaging facilities through a diagnostic imaging repository or a health imaging exchange, you can run models at scale in theory. Or alternatively, you can deploy them in one place and kind of have them run on multiple PAC systems in different hospitals. Or at least you can have a single payer that says, okay, we've looked at all the data, and what has happened in Ontario, although I think it happened bottom up, not top down, is for acute stroke assessment, these AI-derived tools especially for calculating perfusion maps on these perfusion CTs, which a human can't even do, require some kind of computational tool to analyze the images. And the province of Ontario, as an example, has basically deployed a single tool at, most hospitals, certainly most stroke centers that are out there. And in theory, that's a pattern that's a good pattern, and it probably can generate real ROI because you kind of wait for the market and maybe researchers and other jurisdictions to prove out the usefulness of certain models, and then you can be first to deploy them at scale. Not first to deploy at all, but perhaps at scale. So in theory, Canada could have a model like that. I wouldn't say I get the flavor that that's actively happening, but certainly that's a place that Canada could play and could generate real ROI, dollars, or quality of care.
Yeah, I think that strikes on a whole other area. Whatever the players and the mechanisms are that need to be able to make the approvals, sometimes there's a very good operational tool. I'll take 16-bit, for example, where we have the opportunity of having predictive care. You have central repository, so I could do fracture detection on pre-existing x-rays in a repository. Okay, how do we go about getting the approval process and sign up? And that takes a very long time. And sometimes the people that are making the decisions on whether that can be granted or not don't fully understand the components of like the workflow or what the AI or the model is actually doing. And those are challenges. But do think you raise a great point, is that we are behind in many ways, but we have the opportunity, we have infrastructure, we have these stores of data that could be used for a multitude of different reasons. And I could see a lot of opportunities for population health and being able to target, why do we see a preponderance of cancer in this region of...
I was going to say, we can get to talk, when we were kind of alluding to it even in our pre-conversation, there, the opportunity is there and we can get to the barriers, but in theory, you could run all sorts of opportunistic screening tools as kind of the concept here, where what if all the images for 15 million people obtained for all sorts of different reasons are stored in one place for decades as a treasure trove of information, just like in Ontario, we screen for syphilis by using like leftover serum samples from blood draws. You could screen for all sorts of diseases, especially cardiometabolic diseases, like a project that we're trying to get going with the Central Imaging Repository folks, which has already been shown. And we did some of this data with THP data and then outcome data from the ICS, which is kind of a provincial repository of hard-coded data outcomes on the whole population, linked by the health card number in a single public system that basically covers everybody. You get amazing data, and you can show that tools like this can predict cardiovascular events and risk of death by better than traditional risk scores like the Framingham risk score. So the opportunity is totally there, and I think you're right, and depends where we want to get into. The barriers are always, the damn humans always get in the way.
I agree wholeheartedly where the adoption in Canada is very slow. I often will feel bad for eager salespeople from the US that come up to Canada thinking they're just going to kill it. And, it's a slow burn when you're trying to sell in our country. One of the things about the opportunity of helping increase adoption and getting these tools into the hands of real users. Sometimes labs can be useful and effective for validating and seeing how things are going to run in an operational setting. You were instrumental in setting up, and I always love when acronyms sound cool. So you've got AIDE, the AI Deployment and Evaluation Lab at Trillium Health. Can you tell us a bit about why that was started? What was the intent behind that? And give us the lowdown on AIDE.
It's a good one to kind of answer our last question about kind of the arc of these sorts of early adoption efforts. And it's a 5 or 6 year old endeavor that really sought to answer the question. We saw all these early days of models being developed, but it was very difficult to figure out what was real, what was producing real results, that was performing well in terms of a model, but also could work on the diversity of data that populations like Ontario, or especially Mississauga, the region we serve, represent in our data. And also they actually can work in the real workflow with real users and don't create more of an effort than it's worth. And ideally even calculate an ROI so we can help make the decision, should we deploy this or not and why? And so we did a bunch of work. Maybe I should step back and say, who's we? I think the most fun part of this was, and it alludes to our first question around what talent exists around the Toronto-Waterloo corridor. This was, a radiologist, with an engineering operating system as myself, the computer scientist, a kind of software engineer, and kind of population health type researchers. And it was this group of people who came together with the diversity of skills required to look at a model and say, which data do we evaluate it on? How do we evaluate it? And, how do we determine it when we look at the data, whether this is something worth doing or not? So how do we deploy it safely and at high quality? So we did that for a chest x-ray algorithm, which never made it into production, although we learned some interesting things about it. And most recently did it for a head CT algorithm that did make it into production. And we learned from this evaluation, this pre-deployment evaluation, which arguably has become best practice, that in certain conditions, it doesn't work as well as other conditions. So we just remove those from being presented to the end users. And we tried to figure out if in certain scenarios, it was good enough to help us pre-populate some fields, which at the time it wasn't. And then most importantly, to train the users and kind of set expectations, because, we can probably get to this topic if we want, but the real value comes from when the symbiosis between the AI and the human, we err in such different ways that ideally we have this kind of overlap of both Swiss cheeses, so fewer errors can get slipped through the holes. And so if you can understand how the model errs, we kind of know how humans err. And if we can train the humans to recognize the kind of failings of the model, the idea is that the combined entity can perform better than ideally either one by itself. So that was like a 5-year endeavor. The hospital has kind of learned from that experience and has started to take over some of those functions, which is a good thing. But there's lots of growing pains, and it's the same kind of problem when you go from a highly dedicated team with expertise working in AI evaluation to a broader team that may not have the kind of nuanced understanding of especially imaging, because a lot of hospitals, they're not only doing AI in imaging, they're doing AI in the EMR. Maybe they're doing AI scribes, and the skills required to evaluate the whole spectrum of these different AI tools, they're so rare and hard to find that it's almost impossible to find that in one place. And so different organizations are learning different components at different rates. So I think, I don't have full view to what the entire hospital is doing, but they've certainly engaged kind of some senior leaders in the organization to drive, the AI strategy.
If you could expand a bit more on that concept of the Swiss cheese and where AI gets things wrong and where humans get things wrong. There was a great paper Prasant, one of the co-hosts from Simcast, had sent to me last year or so, just about how when AI gets things wrong, it is very alien to just the logic that we would process. I'm sure you've seen the how many R's are there in the word strawberry meme where the AI sounds extremely confident and it's getting the answer wrong. Is there value in understanding the logic process of how it's coming to that conclusion? And maybe before I let you speak, I had a conversation with Wu Jin, and he had referenced a paper in which that sequence of logic that it presents to you has very little to do with what it actually is doing in the background to get to where it's going. It's letting you think it's going A, B, C, D, but really it went A, B, F, G, H, D.
So I think, there's 2 eras worth considering. The deep learning era, the kind of convolutional neural network, and these large language model kind of transformer-based next word predictors. The deep learning era is still, most of the tooling that exists today in the market is from this deep learning era. And really the ways in which those models could fail was very defined. Certainly we reached a point where we could understand how they failed. Let's take the head CT example. The worst thing it could do, let's say, is kind of misclassify something or miss something. And there were only 10 classes to choose from. So you're going to see one of 10 things, and it's going to be either 1 or 0. And it may get the 1 or 0 wrong. That's basically all that could happen. Now you have these large language model architectures, which a lot of the engineering work is trying to constrain the outputs of these models to actually give you something useful that you want. And there are so many different ways that they can err, and they err in such bizarre ways of, maybe the side is wrong, maybe there's an extra word, they repeat words, they repeat sentences, they seem to ignore certain elements, and then you prompt them as a reminder, like, oh, wait, you're right. So that's a whole nother order of magnitude of varieties of errors that we as human users of these tools need to get used to. And people are learning it from doing or Gemini or whatever tool you use, where certainly was true a few months ago. You ask it to do basic math and it's basically terrible. But you ask it to just write some prose and it's beautiful. Now, especially if the facts don't matter, it's really good. So those same kind of ideas need to be applied or are being applied as we speak to kind of development of the next generation of computer vision tools in radiology. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, and especially the element of how do we communicate to users the types of errors and what to expect from them. So as we get a better idea of how they err, we will be able to ignore certain elements, and then you prompt them as a reminder, like, oh, wait, you're right. So that's a whole nother order of magnitude of varieties of errors that we as human users of these tools need to get used to. And people are learning it from doing or Gemini or whatever tool you use, where certainly was true a few months ago. You ask it to do basic math and it's basically terrible. but you ask it to like just write some prose and it's beautiful. Now, especially if the facts don't matter, it's really good. So those same kind of ideas need to be applied or are being applied as we speak to kind of development of the next generation of computer vision tools in radiology. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, and especially the element of how do we communicate to users the types of errors and what to expect from them. So as we get a better idea of how they err, we will be able to better design systems that include both the human and the AI to ideally improve the quality of the final product that gets to the patient or the referring provider.
And so back to your lab, you mentioned there was a chest model that you had evaluated. Are most of the use cases related to computer vision, analyzing the images? Are there use cases that you're running that look at maybe like the plumbing aspects of ensuring the workflow is going to be optimized based on whatever a model would be able to do?
It's a great question. So the more boring the use case, the more interesting I am. So I really like these operational use cases. I know together, again, these were conceptual papers that we did, although it was based on, or work that we did, although it was based on real world problems. You know, the one that we kind of talked about, the, what do we call it? Sharing is caring. The idea of, mapping these heterogeneous data sets from multiple sites where procedure names are named not by any standard or terminology like Radlex or Loink, but however Jimmy from the informatics department felt like naming them. And then if you're the central imaging repository, you have to do that matching. Now, this is 5+ years ago. We had a simple, it would not be deep learning, but a multi-layer perceptron that built a tool to probabilistically map all of these procedure names to a central standard nomenclature that the imaging repository that you at OCINet and other folks had kind of put together. Those are very pragmatic, easy, now super easy things to do. Maybe a little harder to validate, but super easy to do in concept. We did the protocol automation. Again, was only in concept. So this is an obvious task for any radiologist, especially for CT and MR. It's reasonably high volume. For every procedure request that comes in from a physician, we need to instruct the technologist how to perform that examination. Which body part, which is usually more obvious, which does it need contrast or not? If it does, which phase, which specific subtype of an exam? Do you need the Cella protocol for the brain? Do you need the pancreas protocol for the abdomen? Do you need a CTA of the chest? Etc. And so we used a data set from colleagues, I think it was even at the VA in the US. Josh Reicher was my partner in crime there. And we basically showed that the AI can do a pretty good job, especially to, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was certainly high 80s or 90s for first match protocol, and certainly, 95+% chance that the desired protocol would be in the top 3 recommendations. Those are examples of kind of practical tasks that could be done in the workflow. And to some degree, especially the latter one, it's easier to calculate an ROI. It's funny when you do the audit of all these models, and we always have a problem, to your earlier question, of determining performance, because when you end up comparing, like in the protocol case, I think there were like 100 errors out of 1,000 or 2 or whatever the number, 5,000. And so when I manually looked at all the errors, I'm like, it was kind of a toss up between the AI being incorrect and the radiologist being incorrect. And so one of the hardest parts that nobody really talks about in this space is, yes, radiologists are very well trained and very good, but also can be very noisy. There's a lot of variation in how radiologists do things. In the real world especially, there's always extenuating circumstances that cause distractions and errors occur. And when you're using real world data, you find those errors sometimes with the AI. It raises questions about what is the gold standard? How good does an algorithm need to be to work in real life, which may be different than a simulated environment in a perfect study where you could pay people to sit in a room undistracted under perfect circumstances, which is very different than the real world. And I don't think anyone's really answered many of these questions. Everyone's kind of going through the motions of, okay, we're just going to do what we need to do to kind of get through FDA, and then we're going to sell it. But there's some real questions here about, what is ground truth in radiology. Anyways, I got a little bit off track with your question about operational use cases. I think there are some very good ones. I think Farbod, who I worked with, he's kind of working with another smart engineer on automating BMD, right? And helping radiologists not only, report faster, the technologists to acquire the data more reliably, but also to adopt the most recent standards. This is another kind of quality place that AI can play a role. In BMD, bone mineral density assessment, the standard has evolved in Canada from kind of Canadian Association of Radiologists guidelines to this kind of FRAC standard, which is a little bit more complicated and not something many radiologists are trained on, or historically. Obviously, radiologists need to learn it, but wouldn't it be nice if you have a tool that's kind of your assistant to make sure you're following the guidelines properly, which are evidence-based? And so that's the kind of tool CNCode and the Farbod and his team have developed and are offering to Canadian facilities. So I think those sort of workflow use cases are pretty more obvious early tools to adopt. And I'm kind of surprised, although we could talk about why, that more of these aren't out there, because they totally should be. Because this is, if you look broadly speaking at AI where it's being adopted in healthcare, it's not in fancy computer vision where it's generating the ROI, especially in the US more than here. It's like call centers, right? Document processing. It's those tasks that can now be either augmented, semi-automated, or fully automated, where you can really start to generate ROI and notice better quality. Like this is not health related, but, I think it was Lufthansa. I had my first encounter with a bot that actually solved my problem. We had to change a flight and I was dreading however many phone calls and emails and whatever. We literally flip up this chat bot and we have 5 people in the family. And you're always worried, like, is it going to put us in other universes, not even on the same plane?
Yeah.
And it was like that, and it got it right. And so you can imagine there's many healthcare experiences that could be like that. Scheduling your appointment. By God, like who wants to do that in most healthcare facilities now? You call our hospital and, how long does that take? Maybe you get a fax back. Do you get a call back? It's like crazy town. So in systems, especially that are more, that are incentivized to, have a strong, positive patient experience, and where they're incentivized to keep patients coming back to them and they don't want them to leak to other systems, they've invested a lot, especially in the US, in these sorts of tools around boring back office operational type of use cases, which I think should be the first things that we should be adopting in healthcare in Canada.
Yeah, and I can imagine any Paxman could probably give you about 10 things that they would just love to be able to hand over to some sort of a model that could complete the task.
And we should build that, by the way, because like the PACS team, there's not enough PACS people. If you did a Pareto analysis of the types of requests, it's like password and, reboot the system. And that's 80% of the problems.
Yeah.
And this can all be, completed by some kind of probably reasonably simple agentic workflow. You just need to have the permissions to have the computers let loose on your systems, which is something that gives the CIOs all sorts of anxiety and heartburn and restlessness at night. But in theory, these are exactly the things that should be happening in our health system that's kind of resource constrained, because the patients, the taxpayers demand better service, and we have more patients than we can handle. And I think most people kind of have the blinders on and hope that these problems are going away, but every hospital's basically bankrupt, or in lots of debt and can't afford anything and running a deficit. And really we should be much more aggressive at adopting these AI tools, because it'll really move the needle on patient care.
Let's go further with that example of the Paxman. So the Paxman, we've taken 10 mundane things that they spend a lot of time doing that doesn't take a lot of maybe cognitive effort, but now I can give this over to a model and it's going to complete those tasks. So maybe at a large academic center where I used to need maybe 4 Paxmans, I only need 2 now. And so I saw some avatar children running in the background. And so as you have younger children and you're thinking about skills to build for them and education and the opportunity of what employment looks like what do you say to people when, because there's no doubt this has an impact on people's employment. So where should they direct their energy? What would you recommend?
That's also a billion-dollar question. These are big societal questions that have been unanswered. I think AI and its impact on jobs is a huge question. There will be some lines of work where the presence of AI will actually increase demand for that particular product or service, and you'll need more of that. People thought the ATMs would, get rid of all the need for personal banking, but there's tons more transactions if you combine the two, I suppose. And more importantly, the bank teller now doesn't do transaction work. They do higher level work, right? They're your relationship manager. They can help you maybe with a loan now, other things other than just taking in money and putting it out, etc. And then there'll be some that just disappear. And I think it's actively happening in the freelance world as we speak, right? Like the Fiverrs and the Upworks used to be the place where if you want to spend $100, you could get something done. Now, for $20 a month, you can do a lot of those tasks, make a presentation, design something pretty, whatever, or at least get a first draft of it. So I don't have a crystal ball to predict exactly what is going to happen, but certainly soft skills are never going to go away. Interacting with humans, and no matter what you're doing, I think you need to understand how to use AI to do it better. Kurt Langlotz has coined the term that I think has spread well beyond radiology, but the idea that AI won't replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will replace those who don't. And I think that's a very, very accurate descriptor of how the world will play out over the next, decade or two, because it's shifting and you can see it happening, and it's happening very quickly. And I don't think a lot of people realize how quickly it's happening. So yeah, there's certainly a need for society to answer some of those bigger questions. But in the radiology space, for sure, and if you're the PACS facilitator, you should be embracing AI so that you can use it to make sure you don't become obsolete.
I like what you said about soft skills. I almost don't even like calling them soft skills because they are, I think, as we move forward into the next decade, those human skills of being able to connect with people, being a storyteller, those are going to play a very important role in your ability to work with whatever tools that we have at our disposal.
And it's not even just this, and maybe I should be more specific. It's not just soft interpersonal skills. It's also the ability to see strategically and make decisions. Mm-hmm. Who's building these models, right? Humans. Humans still need to define the prompt, right? And if you don't understand the problem well, you can't gather the needs from your potential end customer well, you're going to design the wrong prompt, right? Or if you don't know how to interact with the end user about the evaluation of this, you don't know how to make sense of this data because you're not a domain expert, in radiology or pathology or customer service, you're not going to be able to design a good model. You're going to pick one on some metrics that don't make sense. So to the end user. So I think, and even deciding where to invest, if you're in a company or in a hospital or in a radiology practice or in a PACS team, deciding what to work on is GPT can give you some guidance. But at the end of the day, especially these high level tasks are going to require even smarter people who understand both the business they're in, as well as the tools that they can use to better accomplish their aims. And you're seeing this happen in non-healthcare space where, the leverage that a super expert human who knows a domain and knows the problem and can also kind of knows how to use AI tooling, what they can do. You're seeing 1, 2, 5, 10 person companies generating hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars in revenue from specific products that they have built because they know it so well and they know that space so well, and they know how to basically automate all of the non-human, basically get the most leverage out of the human as humanly possible or as robotically possible.
I just had a chat with Chris Hafey, who's starting up Merciless. I hope I didn't say that wrong, but he is starting up a new company, and we just had a conversation on one of these episodes about how his staff, I think he has about 5 people, and they are able to accomplish so much based on hiring the right smart people and being able to use these tools effectively. I was on Google Scholar before this episode looking up some of your recent papers. You had written about establishing organizational AI governance, and I'd like you to speak a little bit about governance, the important role that it plays. What should we be mindful of when we're thinking of governance in the context of AI?
When I think about governance, it's like the most boring word in the world, but pragmatically speaking, if you want to deploy these tools, you have to govern them, especially now, and especially if you want to be not the last adopter, and especially if you want to make sure you're getting real ROI. And the reason is that these tools they don't work like traditional software. They're not deterministic where one thing goes in and you get the same thing out every time. They're very stochastic. You don't know exactly what you're going to get. You have an idea probably, but you're not entirely sure. And it's not too dissimilar to medications. And there's a good parallel there, and you can apply it to some of our work here. When a hospital, as an example, buys medications for their hospital, they still have a committee of people who decide which, based on the evidence, are going to work in their setting best. And then they also monitor for any bad outcomes that happen and report that back to the drug manufacturers. So I think you need a similar kind of idea when you're deploying AI tools in your institution, big or small, where you have an idea of what it is you're trying to accomplish with the tools, like clear outcomes. You can kind of go through the marketplace, which could be outside or inside your 4 walls, to determine which tool best meets those criteria. You want to be able to validate that in advance, because a tool that was developed in, Southeast Asia may not work on a North American market, let's say. And you want to be able to stick it into the workflow that all the users understand how to use it safely and with high quality. And then you want to be able to monitor it, see how it's performing over time, and certainly pull the cord if something isn't going well. So the questions that every organization needs to answer are like, what to govern, why, and how. And you don't want to over-govern in the sense that, you don't want a small committee of 3 people deciding everything, because you want some bottom-up innovation. But you don't want the hospital having no idea what systems are being used, especially because you can have all sorts of risk of leakage of data if people don't use tools properly, where some doctor in the emerge is using their phone to take pictures of a patient and using some derm AI thing, but nobody knows about it, is kind of just asking for trouble. So our paper there really just described us adopting a bunch of ideas that the folks at Duke had collated themselves from about 50 different hospitals across North America who were adopting AI. And I'd say nobody got it perfect, but when you get all the ideas together, you have a nice solid framework, kind of a 4-step framework that you can work with to try and deploy AI tools in health systems safely and with high quality.
Terrific. Okay, so I've really enjoyed this conversation. Yes. Thank you very much, Ben. Is there any closing thoughts that you just wanted to sign off with before we call it a episode?
No, listen, I appreciate the conversation. I think these are good ones to be having. And, if there's folks listening who want to reach out around some of the work we're doing or just ask a question, always eager to engage kind of young people who are passionate about making a difference and making a change, especially ones that can have both hats of, hey, I understand what's happening in healthcare and I understand how to use modern technology to really improve things. We just need more of those people to step out of the shadows and improve this disastrous health system that we currently live in.
It's a great way to end it. Thank you very much, Ben.
Dream.com, HL7 IHE and Snap. We're building the future, never looking back.